Hello and welcome to my talk on AngularJS and Spring. I'm creating modular test-driven spas with Spring and AngularJS. The goals in this talk are kind of like to give you an introduction to AngularJS, talking about build and deployment, integration with Spring, modularization, testing, and a couple of UI considerations I have in there. So kind of like I wanted to make this talk a little bit different than a couple of the other talks that are out there in terms of just focusing purely on Angular or focusing purely on Spring. I kind of like wanted to give like an Angular spin from the viewpoint of what I hope somewhat of a what a typical Spring web application developer may encounter having now to develop client-side application. And I have children, so I needed to put some stuff like this in. About myself, I'm a Java web developer since 2005. I was fortunate enough in my career to always have to be able to work with Spring, so that was my nice experience. But work with struts, GWT, the whole Spring thing. Did a little bit of Flex on the side. There was a sprinkle of Rails someplace, and kind of like worked primarily the last 3 years as I've been a committer on the Spring integration, Spring Batch, Spring XD projects, and for the development of Spring XD, we kind of like reactivated my user skills a little bit in terms of UIs. So together with some coworkers, we basically we have been working on the Spring XD UI using Angular starting, at least for me, in January 2014. In my spare time, I also run my own conference. So if you're ever in Atlanta, stop by, say hello. And that's it. Oh, non-screen activities. In my spare time, that's basically what I'm doing in Atlanta. Little green stuff, anything that's borderline pushing the hardiness zones of what you can do in Atlanta, that's me. Palms, bananas, all that kind of good stuff. So what does this have to do with this talk? Actually, I did my demo application. I wanted to combine the hobby with the work-related stuff. So my demo app is basically kind of like a collection management system. I mean, like a kind of Hello World version of it. So I was running literally around with my cell phone in my yard, taking like GPS coordinates of my plants, collected those, and I put those into my little app, so I can show you a couple of things in AngularJS that are kind of like beyond your typical Hello World or chat application. So AngularJS. Question. Who is using AngularJS already? Oh wow, that's a big crowd. Nice. Probably, I don't know, 60–70% of the room. That was pretty neat. Anybody using Backbone? Still a few hands out there. Probably, I don't know, 10 people. Who's using jQuery? That's a solid 80% at least, maybe even 90. Spring MVC, same realm, 80–90%. Spring Boot, right? That's quite a few people, 10–20%. Did I miss any other single-page JavaScript framework that people are using that you really would like to mention? Yes. Yes, mentioned that a little bit. Let me have that in another slide when I kind of mention that. But yeah, Ember, that's certainly a good one. Anybody using? Yep.
Used Wit for a while, but I'm done.
I think I now understand your pain. Anybody using Knockout? Okay, one person. Good. All right. What are spas? I was lazy, I just copied off the definition from Wikipedia. A single-page application, also known as a single-page interface, is a web application or website that fits on a single page with the goal of providing a more fluid user experience akin to a desktop application. I don't know, I have to credit little thingies. So in my understanding, it's kind of like everything's kind of blurry, but basically in a sense it's like, you can see URL and you get your initial payload from the server, which then will bootstrap your client-side application, which then, instead of having to refresh your entire browser window, you basically incrementally exchange either JSON data, HTML fragments, etc. I mean, that's there's certainly, you can even push that a little bit. I mean, WebSockets have binary support, etc. So, but that's kind of like the general understanding, the way I see it. So basically Ajax on steroids, I guess, in the olden days when we kind of like got little things. My personal background is a little bit, it's a little bit like a space versus tab discussion. People love JavaScript or they have little problems with it. I'm kind of like in the latter camp. The less I write JavaScript, the better. Some people like JavaScript a lot. It has certainly lots of great features in there. But if you ever want to get some niceties of what JavaScript is capable of, particularly when you're coming from a Java world where you have static typing and all that kind of good stuff, take a look at JavaScript. WTFJS.com has all kinds of nice little niceties that you've got to be kidding. Anyway, so that's just my opinion of personally. I like to write less JavaScript, and that's kind of like where I feel like where at least for me it made a click when I went into the world of AngularJS. That looks kind of tempting. That might be useful for also the average Java developer that all of a sudden needs to do a little bit of UI work here and there, at least good enough to be dangerous. Certainly JavaScript, the good parts. Take a look at that one. It's a thin book, so just imagine all this big pile of stuff you can do in JavaScript. The good stuff is actually very, very digestible. It's very little. So take a look at that book. I started at some point with Backbone. We actually, when we initially did the UI development for Spring XD and the very early prototypes, 2013, we were evaluating the various frameworks we can use for UI development. And back in the day, it was just AngularJS was just, it was certainly out there, but it's certainly, we were a little bit like, Backbone was still like the king in the room. And so we started doing that, and eventually they were like, hey, Gunnar, you need to head over, help with the Backbone stuff. And well, people say like Backbone is small, but once you start writing good pieces of functionality in there, it has many moving parts, in my opinion. You're starting having a ton of boilerplate code. You have to deal with all kinds of different frameworks in there. From, I plugged in Marionette or Model Binder or Relational, etc. So it became difficult to traverse that ecosystem. So I started to look for something else, and that's where I found Angular. But it's certainly not the only choice you have. I like it. However, you have to take a look at Ember or Knockout. Those are certainly big contenders out there. So if you're in the evaluation process of like, hey, we need to get some single-page applications out there or developed, you want to learn something, certainly consider those as alternative. I heard good things about them. I haven't spent too much time on them yet, though. Quick AngularJS, kind of like the introduction of what AngularJS is. I mean, it's an MVC framework, or MV, when you figure something out what the C is. It provides dependency. We'll talk about dependency injection. It's expression support, filters, directives, routing, modules. Also, just as a pointer here, if you download the slides, throughout my slides, I put hyperlinks up to all kinds of different resources. So if you want to read more about things, you can do that as well. The AngularJS page has a good pointer to concept as well. Model. This is actually where having had my little experience coming from the Backbone world, or that little sliver of experience there coming to the AngularJS world, that was really a nice revelation all of a sudden, that you can, instead of having to create like customized model objects that, you know, in order to get model binding working, etc. In Angular, you can just use anything. Just, you know, take your JSON, stick it into your, basically use it, and it becomes basically your model. You basically, in the comments, you know, most commonly you put it onto the scope. That's kind of like your, how you ultimately express your model. It's a little blurry per se. I mean, you basically all the good examples, you always put it on the scope, but you also can create your own domain objects. Maybe later I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the scope is basically the glue between the controller and the view. So whenever you have a controller, kind of like, think about it, Spring MVC, I think I felt it mentally very, a fairly good mapping when I think in Spring MVC terms and AngularJS, that maps to some degree quite nicely. So I have basically my controller and my view, and I need to basically, in order to communicate between both, I use the scope to store values, but also potentially functions that my UI can actually trigger. So it's the glue between the controller and the view. It mimics the view, the DOM, so it's hierarchical. So you have on the top you have your root scope, and then depending on where you trigger action points within your page, you basically then have various child scopes to be aware of. So that sometimes can bite you a little bit. But killer feature, in my opinion, with AngularJS was always like its data binding capabilities that are kind of like built in. I find that's always kind of like amazing how they actually make that work. Reminded me a little bit in the olden Flex days, they had something similar. So you change something here, and then your values change on the other side, and you don't have to write a single line of JavaScript, which is kind of nice. And I demonstrate that in a little bit. Basically, the model is kind of like your single source of truth. Whenever you change values, the changes should be propagated throughout your model, or whoever uses it within the application. Occasionally, you may have to use kind of like underneath. You use the watch and the apply. Sometimes that automatic propagation of state changes, you may have to look at use the apply, for example, to make that happen. The view, that one was kind of like interesting. Moving into the Angular world was that, when you look at Backbone, etc., you had like all your kind of like dedicated templating engines. Mustache or Underscore has some stuff. So basically you created like your little templating thing that you then evaluated into your HTML page. AngularJS kind of like goes the route of, well, HTML is my markup. So basically, and then basically sprinkle little what they call directives that allow you to get directives and expressions to basically put out values or display collections of items. But in the view, kind of like with JSPs or whatever, use thime, leaf, etc. Minimize logic as much as possible. And in the Angular world, it's all about writing custom directives to kind of like have as little logic in your views as possible. Kind of like that's my little hello world I have in here. So this is a functioning application. Basically, all you have here is you declare kind of like the main directives in AngularJS is kind of like a ng app. So that's kind of like your entry point into your Angular app. In this case, you also have another an ng init. So in this case, that's kind of like I'm using that to initialize my model in this very simplistic hello world. Just give it the first name, last name, and then basically have input fields that will basically output those changes I do. First name, last name, and then I'm basically just typing, putting it out on the bottom using an expression first name, concatenating with the last name, and then using a filter, using the pipe symbol to uppercase it. So that's kind of like a concept they have in Angular, is you can also have filters that basically you can, using the pipe, do small logics in your expressions. Let me see if that actually works. Does it come up? It does. Cool. Run. All right. So basically, all this does is here, but it, have my input fields. But this is kind of neat way you show the simple way of the data binding. I just type, and the change is automatically propagated down to when I output the code here. And the neat thing is I have not a single line of basically JavaScript in here. So that's kind of like where the hello world is certainly quite nice to play with. And the link is in the slides. So if you want to play with this stuff, it's there. Of course, you wouldn't put the ng-init, etc. in your normal application. So this one doesn't have a controller yet. It's literally just a simple way to get started. But it also shows you that you can kind of like progressively add things into Angular. So you don't have to use the entire the kitchen sink of like you don't always have to use a controller, for example. I mean, it's kind of like you can sprinkle it into your application as needed. But eventually would like to put the controller in there to abstract your logic out. And it's basically used to set up your scope, either for the values or the behavior for your functions and onto the scope. So for example, if you press a button saying like, add a new item or delete whatever, that's what you trigger from the UI. That will then being triggered in your controller. Don't do UI work using controllers, so that's literally just kind of like basically like Spring MVC as well. So just keep the logic in there. If you need UI customization or encapsulate that, use directives or filters instead. This is kind of like the same example, a little bit of slightly advanced. So what I did here now is I have an ng app. I gave it actually a name, since now it has a little bit more logic in there. Before it was an anonymous application. Now I call it Ola. ng controller, that basically is another controller I'm basically now calling. That's basically where I'm now externalized the initialization of my logic. But itself, otherwise, it's still the same application. Still typing out first name, last name. Have the input fields and type it out. Kind of like that's a very simplistic controller in this case. So I'm basically calling the var app angular.module. It's called Ola, so that's kind of like what your application is now called. And I'm basically creating on my app, I'm creating a controller, called it name controller. I then have a function in here that basically provides the scope. And this is actually where you see the first time now dependency injection. So AngularJS has kind of like, dependency injection by name. So the name actually matters here, that you type in function and then a $scope. So anything prefixed with a $, that's Angular specific. So in this case, you inject the scope, and then on the scope, you're setting the first name and the last name, and that's it. That's basically the working application. As I mentioned, so doing this type of a dependency injection is, in one sense, very nice. By name, nice, it looks nice. You have, however, problems when you're talking about minification. So JavaScript likes to be minified, squeezed together, and therefore often you also see the array notation when you declare dependency injection in AngularJS, where you basically do this type of pattern where you declare a string with the $, for example, $scope, and then you have the function later on that basically injects the thingy, so it still works even though it's minified. The minifier will not touch the string itself, so it works. Of course, it looks a little convoluted. I personally like to use stuff like ng-annotate, A few days ago, I would have told you use ng-min. It turns out I ran into an issue that one is kind of like on the way out, kind of like the way of insane JavaScript innovation. There's new stuff coming all the time. So use ng-annotate now. But what it does basically is like it integrates into your build process when you build your applications, either using talking about Grunt and Gulp a little bit later. But it helps with the pre-processing of those annotate or basically Angular specific functions or injection points that you don't that you can still use the simpler version. You don't have to use the array notation, and that seems to work actually quite nicely. Expressions, kind of like I guess think GSTL to some degree. Just typing out, you can use filters in the expressions. No flow control statements, so that's fairly straightforward. Filters. What you can do with filters is, for example, in collections, for example, you can use those things to, let's say you have a data grid, for example, you're typing out, you need to have filter, like you can really easily create like a little text input field saying like, hey, as I type, only show a subset of data items in my table that match that query I'm doing. So you can filter those out. You have some ordering capabilities as well, so those are built into Angular, which is kind of neat. Of course, you can also write your own filters if you need to, but yeah, it's kind of neat to provide you a whole bunch of extra stuff that otherwise you would have write a whole bunch of custom JavaScript for. As I said, directives, they are marker on a DOM element, so they're basically a place where you externalize, or if you need to do your instead of repeating your logic in your views, you can use directives to make that happen. I have later on I talk about all kinds of also like third-party directives. So that seems to be like there's a whole ecosystem around AngularJS that providing you custom directives that you can use in your applications. So you basically can anything in Angular is basically a directive as well. So you have ng-controller, ng-app, etc. You can, when you write your own directives, you can make an attribute and directive, an element. So you could have custom elements in your views. Theoretically, you can even create like CSS classes that are Angular specific. Everybody seems to say don't do that, but usually attributes, elements. That's kind of like your typical use case. I have a link in here that's a nice. I thought was a good summary of various ways of implementing directives. It was quite helpful in understanding them a little bit more to detail. Routing. So we all need to wire stuff together eventually. So you have your your views, your controllers. You want to have your URLs in your application. So basically, you wire whatever URLs you're hitting, wire them together with the views, and usually optional, but typically you do controller together using routing. Angular has ng-route built in. For Spring XD, we have been using UI router, which is it's kind of like routing on steroids in Angular. It's absolutely fantastic. I'm not even sure if I would even recommend using the built-in version. I just felt it was easy, but yet extremely powerful to use that. We had to use it in Spring XD, for example. We typically, you have your URL and map that to controllers, etc. But we also had the concept of tabs in Spring XD. So basically, what it helps you to do is, let me just maybe even can bring this up. Where do we have Spring XD? Do we have it here? Is it still running? Okay, cool. So basically, anything in Spring XD has deep linking support. Everything is bookmarkable. So that's kind of like where Angular has, in my opinion, had a great, wonderful strengths. There is, I can, how often did we bitch about the back button not working, refresh button not working when dealing with kind of rich client applications. And with UI router and AngularJS, I can basically make my entire application. It works always at all times. Also, it is fostered by having a build process every time you make a change. Actually, using I'm using Yeoman for building building my Angular application. Is every time I'm saving, they're using this little WebSocket connection between your build and your browser. You save, it builds, reruns everything, even does a unit test, and automatically refreshes your browser. So if I would lose my state in my browser, it would kind of suck. So basically, it kind of like encourages you to write that type of application where you can bookmark this thing at all times, which is nice. So in this case, I have tabs, modules, definitions, deployments, and if you look at the UI, it always changes with it. So, and if you dive deeper, so let's say at jobs executions, and I go into the job execution details, it goes into the details here as well. So it basically, what UI router gives me is kind of like state management that is even independent of the URL. So it's kind of like a state machine, and you can create kind of like custom flows that works really nicely. And it helped us to implement this without having to resort to extra components out there. So there's like, for example, there's Angular has UI components for Bootstrap, for example. That's what we use as our UI tool here. But at that time, it was still on Bootstrap 2.0, whatever it was. It was not yet on 3.0, so it's kind of like it has dedicated tab support. So I was looking for something else, and eventually I discovered UI router, which allowed me to do that without having to do. So I could just use plain Bootstrap component, just plain Bootstrap, and still implement everything, which was kind of neat. All right. Next. Oops. Yep, straight. That's basically it. I have a link over to the routes in Spring XD itself, so it gives you an idea of like how the routing works. So you basically define, instead of URLs, you're defining states that are nestable. You can go further, which then they can be abstract. You can even add data points to them. If, for example, if you need for authentication purposes, provide some additional data, etc. So so that's basically much that. Modules, hang on tight there. We do that a little later. Do a quick demo on my demo application I have, which was my little botanic application. So, what I have here is list of plants. Nothing fancy. I have basically type those out. I have when I go down here, I have plant details, which I'm showing, what the genus, the species name is. I have saved the longitude and latitude information of my plants, and I basically have some pictures, and then also I can upload some additional pictures down here. So, and what else do I have? Oh yeah, I do have. Yep. Oh, security. I got that working last night. I should talk about that a little later in this talk. But admin, don't do that in production. Huh?
You could have added a filter over there on the plants, like just to filter out when you do a search.
Yeah, you could probably do that. Yeah, that should be easily. It was like one thing I was running out of time. I was like putting a little filter in there, but I have authentication, basic, simplistic, but it's there. I have authorization in my app, so I can now, if I wanted to delete a plant, I can do that. Just throw that out. And if I wanted to upload plants, I do have here. Let's see here. This is a needle palm. I should have git dev botanic ng, which was kind of neat. That's a dedicated source. Where is it? Source, resources, demo images.
So just on the authentication, right? Did you use Spring Security or?
Yes, it does. I'm talking about that a little later. Yeah, I got that. I got that integrated actually. That was a little nerve-wracking. Almost broke my entire application this morning. All right, so in this case, also, I'm just using a directive here, right? So this is kind of like a file upload directive. I think it's even called Angular file upload. It gives you ability to have preview pictures. You can drop pictures onto your page and put them in there. You can then upload them all. Let's do that. And it automatically, I made it so that once I'm uploading them, they are immediately added to the page. And all that. Another interesting way I wanted to show you the data binding I have in here is the ability to, I'm logged in now, let's say I'm adding a plant. Get my location, let's see if that works. Eventually, maybe, yep it does. So, of course my Google map doesn't show up. Huh, that blows. Ah, I know what happens, I disabled it. Ah. Let's not rock the boat. But basically, I will refresh and polish the sample application later on and put that all up onto the GitHub repo. So basically what I have in here, or had until I realized I was working offline, so I disabled it. Basically have a Google Maps that you can basically move your pointer, mark your location on the map. It automatically updates the latitude and longitude. But on the flip side also, if you change in the input file, field the longitude, latitude values in the input field, it also will move your marker on the Google Maps. So it kind of like was an interesting way of going beyond a little bit my little hello world that I showed earlier. But just type them in. Add plant, and it should then be added to the application. At least that's the plan. Whatever happens there. All right, so, oh yeah, and I have a little bit of WebSockets in here as well, which may or may not work. I literally, 10 minutes before I went into this talk, I broke my sample application. Oh, it does, it comes up. So every 10 seconds, I think, I have a little poller running on the back end of the application, and it will randomly select a picture that's on the data store, and we'll add that over to the application itself. Hopefully it will be a different picture next time. Otherwise, it's another bug. Yep, different picture, so cool. So at least that works. Oh, and I'm using another directive here, masonry, which allows me to automatically tile images or any data points on my grid, on my page, kind of like so that it fits into a grid. So so that I can, it automatically realigns pictures as well. It's kind of like a little mesmerizing here. But yeah, same thing here. Basically, no JavaScript for this one. It's literally just to give you an idea of how that looks when I use those custom directives. All right, UI code, app, views, garden. That's all I have. It's basically just give my little attribute masonry, basically just telling him, hey, I'm using that directory, do some custom specific classes there it needs, and then all I'm doing here is plain AngularJS. I'm iterating over the plant images, all the images I have, and put them out. I kind of like maybe not the most efficient way, but all I'm getting back is basically the JSON response. I have the image data base64 encoded as a JSON property, and use that to just print that out onto the UI as my image. So certainly a little bit overhead there, but it works. It's kind of interesting.
Realigning the images, is it like you're using Bootstrap or something?
What do you mean realigning? Oh, that's part of that masonry. So basically, when you resize, it kind of like automatically detects boundaries and realigns the pictures onto your page, depending on how that works. So it's a nice little thing. All right. Hopefully, I'm not running out of time. Build and deployment. So You basically have, when you start diving into the brave world of client-side JavaScript-based application, you start running into the question of like, how do I build that stuff? I mean, it's nice that you can build a command line via JavaScript tools, but eventually I have a Java backend. In this case, I have a Spring Boot backend. I go a little bit more into detail later. But I need to integrate it into my CI builds. I need to integrate it into my Maven or Gradle build. How do I do that? Or do I need to? So in that regard, it's also important to, particularly for client-side application, to think about web resource optimization. So I already mentioned, you need to minify your images, your JavaScript, kind of like optimize everything down to the nth degree. You may have to think about, fingerprinting of your static resources, and that kind of like flows into the equation as well. So what in terms of tooling, minification, merging, compression, caching. So that certainly becomes a big equation of how to deciding of where the tooling is I want to use for building my application. For example, anybody who's using YFlow? Or a few people. So basically, the notion is that it's kind of like a plugin for originally Firefox came from Yahoo. There's similar tools also from the Google folks. It basically tells you how crappy your application is. In many cases, it's not necessarily your middle tier or your backend that's kind of like the problem, but it's the UI. So you basically want to minimize the amount of requests you're doing from the client, from your client browser to the server. Ideally, you would like to have, instead of having to download like 20, 30 JavaScript files, maybe one should be sufficient. Maybe one CSS file. To kind of like cut down on to make that more efficient, since it's more optimized than having doing multiple requests and dealing with the overhead. So it gives you a little grade, and you can use that to see how well your site is optimized. So in terms of tooling for building your applications, you certainly have kind of like, I see certainly two avenues. One is you kind of like stick on the Java side, use the Java tooling. So there are options like Bro4j. That's certainly, I think, the best option we have right now in Java land. And Java would be another one. So kind of like tools that allow you to wrap, and they've been around for several years, that basically do the minification, compression, etc. On your static resources. Spring for one, as mentioned in numerous talks we had here at Spring 1, provides support for those things as well. So at least the building blocks are then there. So hopefully it would be nice to maybe see Bro4j support wrapped into Spring for one, or having support into that direction there, as well. That's more comprehensive. You also have on the Java tooling side, you could use WebJars. So kind of like how do you manage dependencies? That's another one. So you want to get your JavaScript, CSS files, these are the third-party dependencies. You want to get those in there. There's a project called WebJars that kind of like gives you Maven coordinates for client-side dependencies. Spring Boot has some support for WebJars. So that's for example another an option. The problem seems to be, though, at least in my opinion, when you look into what people are using and where the activity is, you can probably pull off nice projects using those tooling, and it's certainly an avenue you should, if you explore how to build those applications, go explore those options, because in a sense I actually would like that approach a lot, because it's certainly feels like we seem to have the process, it feels a little less flaky sometimes. However, I felt like the activity is really on the client side. So if you look at the tooling you have on the JavaScript, in the JavaScript ecosystem, I mean, it's not even like, you know, if you look at some of the tools on the Java side, it's like, one committer, a few stars, you know, it's not bad, but it's kind of like, go over to the JavaScript side and it's like, whoa, I have arrived. There's like, the activity there is just very impressive, particularly when you run into problems. You know, you need to quickly find answers of, be it a bug or did I screw something up, etc. So, for example, I had like quite a bit of problems for one of the keynote demos. I wanted to, I migrated the Spring XD UI to integrate that into just a theme, basically, for one of the keynotes. And you know, instead of in Spring XD, we're using Grunt and kind of like JavaScript tooling. But there I wanted to use, well, let me use Row4j, for example, to make that happen. And what we do is, for our theming is we use Bootstrap and we use less. Less is kind of like, allows you to kind of like script your CSS files a little bit. And it keeps it much nicer maintainable in terms of maintaining your CSS. And integrating with Row4j, I was running into a few issues, and I was like, literally, I found one answer, and that was it. There was nothing else on the Google index. It certainly felt a little bit more tumbleweedy kind of situation sometimes, so that's some things you need to be aware of. On the JavaScript side, you know, everything these days there, you know, Node is your friend. Use Grunt seems to be the main tool, although looks like Gulp is a good run-up. It seems to be like people like it a lot. I almost wanted to write my example application using Gulp, since it's, instead of Grunt, it's stream-based versus using file interactions. But the current seed projects you have there, for example, I'm using Yeoman and particular Angular seed to bootstrap my application. They provide you a really nice Grunt file that provides all the optimization points you could ever think of that we as a Java web application developer never even really considered. Like, for example, like they have like a optimization for PNG images. So kind of like they scrape out a few kilobytes out of your images, for example. So it's kind of nice. And eventually it looks like they may migrate over to Gulp, but for the time being, they're still on Grunt. So I'm using Grunt. And it does, works okay, works good. Yeah.
On the Grunt and board that you're using, if you're building a wall, like, you know, because you have the backend as Spring, how are you using Grunt like on the front end side?
Let me talk about that when I talk about Spring Boot integration. So kind of like, so right now, on the Spring XD side, we basically went to the route, you know, onto the route of basically make it as much. It should work as if you have a JavaScript developer, or you know, there's a pure client-side developer that has no understanding of Java or our build tools. They should still be able to work with it. I mean, they should just take it and do their Grunt build, and everything is cool. They're happy in their Node world, etc. On the flip side, though, it should also integrate with our Maven tooling. So that's kind of like what we did on the Spring XD side. So they're kind of like they're plugins basically for Maven and Gradle to make that integration happen. So, so for example, on the Spring XD side, we're using Gradle, and for my application here, I'm using Maven for running Botanic ng. Is you can actually have there are basically plugins available that allow you to install Node, install all the dependencies, the Node dependencies as well as the Bower dependencies. So you kind of like have, you know, for your build tools, they use Node and its dependency management system. Bower, that's kind of like the dependency management for all your JavaScript and CSS dependencies. So it basically installs all that for you. So in the perfect world, every now and then you run into issues. It's, you know, it's lots of moving parts there, but you should be able to install it without having to expect that it already exists on the system. I'm not making that promise that it works perfectly on Windows, so people seem to neglect that portion a little bit there these days. But that tooling, that's the route we went on Spring XD, and that seems to work okay. Oh, and Spring Boot, I'm using the Maven front-end plugin to make that integration, to bundle all the stuff up, and then put that into the resource folder that Spring Boot provides. All right. Questions so far? Right. Nobody's leaving the room yet. Yeah. So.
So I was reading Angular doesn't support WebSocket. I guess there is some API.
You can certainly plug in your own stuff in there. I mean, it basically provides provides stuff for doing RESTful calls, etc. It has like the HTTP or the resource direct support, for example, so you to make RESTful calls. But it doesn't provide. Actually, my sample application has WebSocket support in there. So all I did was basically like, I mean, it's certainly kind of hacky the way I did it. I just literally just used the Spring the stump support for and SockJS, and basically just used it in my application. I mean, I should probably integrate it, externalize it into like a service or whatever within Angular, but it's certainly not a problem at all. It's kind of like stays out of your way there. All right, Spring Boot. Well, you all saw on that one that you can fit Spring Boot into a tweet. Where the way I started using Boot was actually kind of like for rapid prototyping initially. So I was hammering away on my little demo apps, and even like if you have client-side people, you may want to not wait until your backend people to provide all the services, REST services, etc., that you need on the client side. So you may want to quickly implement a couple of REST services yourself. And Spring Boot in that regard it's kind of like a really nice tool of quickly providing, being able to set up REST endpoints that your client then can use. It provides a whole bunch of starter pumps. It has über-jar support, so basically, all the dependencies in your Boot application can be wrapped into one single jar. The jar becomes executable, and has Maven Gradle plugins, auto configuration support. So whatever, for example, is on your class path, it may automatically pull that in as provide that as a service. And kind of like main is back. So that's kind of like the main interface for my Botanic application. So I have enable auto configuration, a couple of annotations out there, have some scheduling in there. I did some. I'm basically using Spring Data REST on the backend for my application to expose my data. So there's really not that much business logic in there. A couple of interfaces. One customization I did for my REST interfaces was that Spring Data REST for its HOS support, the domain objects don't provide IDs. It turns out I could not really yet find out a perfect way to, while I like the concepts of HOS, to integrate it nicely with an Angular application. There seems to be an impedance mismatch in terms of I would like on my client-side app generate URLs that are nice and kind of like feel RESTful, yet all I get back in the HOS world are links that are complete basically resources. So theoretically I should never worry about what my IDs are on my domain objects. So that's kind of like an outstanding question of how to make that happen efficiently in an AngularJS application without having to reconstitute state from the very beginning in the application. So that's an open question. I have not found an answer yet. So all I did in the quick time was like, well, it's nice to discover URLs manually. I hard-coded them in my application, so don't tell anybody, please. But expose the IDs so that you can enable that manually. And otherwise, it's just I have my static just Spring application run, pointing back to my main class, and just execute it. A few other configuration points for WebSockets or for uploading my file data, etc. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Security. That's kind of like one late addition that basically I wonder if that helped me breaking my application to some degree. But wanted to also see like how can I integrate security and Spring security into my AngularJS applications, and you know, how to deal with authentication, authorization. You know, potentially how does it, you know, think about it also when you add security to your application, how does it affect testing? You know, do you need to put security right into your AngularJS application? Maybe you can have AngularJS application, whatever client application you run, also run behind an authenticated, you know, wall, and kind of, you know, have your authentication, you know, form-based, traditional, and then later you start your client-side application. And so in this case, I started using Spring Session, so which is a project Rob Winch is writing on. It's kind of like milestone 1 right now. What that basically does, it provides you with basically with a better abstraction, a better customization of what session means in your web application, or, you know, in your Java Spring MVC application. Because traditionally it's just a cookie, right? It's JSession ID, that's all you have. And the customization is there a little problematic. I have a REST service, right? I mean, I could do like full OAuth, the whole 9 yards. In this case, what I wanted to do was kind of like just provide, kind of like what Twitter calls XAuth, kind of like you basically authenticate, and then your REST resources provide an HTTP header, that XAuth token that basically provides the session ID. So you're authenticated on the server using traditional Spring MVC, but you basically pass that token around for authentication purposes. You know, eventually it will expire. So in that case, you can use Spring Session to customize the session behavior of the application, and also store the session data itself in Redis, so, or any caching abstraction you may have, be it Hazelcast or, you know, just a plain a map. In this case, I'm using a HTTP session strategy. There are basically 2 available. I'm using the header HTTP session strategy that provides that XAuth token. By default, it uses the cookie HTTP session strategy. So that's kind of like the way how I implement security, and kind of work through that depending on your time through that implementation. So it's out there in the sample application. Take a look at that. But how to integrate, coming back, how to integrate your client-side application into Spring Boot. So Spring Boot basically by default has default resources from the class path. So that's kind of like a nice little integration point there, is that Spring Boot serves, you can serve your static content out of a jar file basically from your source main resources directory. So you can use that to basically, when you build your using Grunt, whatever, to build up your application, that you basically eventually it will end up in the public directory, you know, one of the resources directory for Spring Boot, and therefore you can just bundle up the UI itself. So you can either make it so that it's part of your Spring Boot application, or what we did, you can even make kind of like UI pluggable, right? So you can provide like an API where you just provide REST services, and the UI may just become a Maven dependency, right? So you can like declare your project that has the REST API, declare dependency on the UI that basically pulls in the jar file that has the UI resources in there, and because of Spring Boot's default, all of a sudden your UI resources are being served out of that application. So it helps you to make, potentially make application pluggable, kind of like composable, almost. All right, backend. Oh yeah. So all I have basically here is source main Java. You know, I have my, as I showed you, I have my main app here. You know, not too much in here, pretty much what I showed. Some customization for JSON. So I'm kind of like a person that likes human readable dates, not the timestamp. Hard to decipher. And then we basically have a whole bunch of configuration data, like configuration for security. So for example, I have here my your typical Spring security. That's where I'm also plugging in that is custom session handling support. Basically say like which URLs are basically secured. In this case, I'm just using anything that does a post onto the plans to create new plans that has basically security. Beyond that, I'm having WebSocket support in here, so nothing really fancy. All I'm doing is basically like have my message broker in here. I have a queues topics, just plain configuration, and then I basically have for that I have a service that my default picture service. All that one does. I'm basically injecting a messaging template, and then I'm just sending queue pictures, and that's basically gets sent out to anybody that's connected to my application. In terms of domain, the model itself, I have a couple of plain old Java objects for my garden, my image, my location. Nothing fancy in there. Just a couple of GPA annotations on them, and then I'm using Spring Data REST to expose those resources out there. So it's kind of neat that there's basically just a plain.
Backend you're using here?
This one is just using what am I using? HSQL. Yeah, just nothing fancy. For the session support, it's Redis. So that's pretty much it. There's really not that much to it. I mean, when I started out, provided my initial service, I mean, it was like 3-4 classes. That's pretty much it. It's kind of like ridiculous.
Can you put some front-end testing for Angular? Like front-end testing? Like how are you testing your Angular code?
I'm talking about that one in a second. Let's go back here. Let's first talk about modularization, or at least what my understanding of it is. Right now, you kind of like, there are almost like also different philosophies in the JavaScript world, or in the Angular world. Angular itself has modules, so you can kind of like, break out your application into various modules. But those is kind of like it's just a semantic splitting out of basically dependencies within the Angular application. It does not deal with any. Angular itself doesn't have anything built in terms of module loading. Kind of like if you, for example, that's basically where RequireJS comes into play. So if you have, you basically can declaratively declare dependencies within your JavaScript, in your controller service, etc. I'm using specific dependencies. And if those are not being used yet, it will basically trigger RequireJS to load those asynchronously for you. So you kind of like, theoretically, the promise is basically like you're only loading what you actually need. So that's kind of like the main promise there. And now on the Spring XD side, we're using RequireJS within our application. For my demo app, I don't. I kind of like it's kind of like another one of those. Tabs versus white spaces discussions. I like the general idea of it a lot, but some of the tooling seems to kind of like all of a sudden you have to think differently. Documentation, your application behaves slightly differently. Configuration is a little different. It falls off a little bit on the edges there. Certainly doable. Also, my main, particularly when you start learning out, rather. It's already so much stuff I need to keep track of, and in many cases I feel like that the big load, particular for what we're doing like mid-size applications, nothing like dramatic, right? I mean, the big thing is like Bootstrap, AngularJS. I mean, those stuff you need throughout your whole application. So those are probably the big data points you have within your app. If you and then your custom code is, I mean, I don't know, probably somebody has really needs for it. I mean, really use RequireJS if needed. But I may not want to overly advocate its use. So if you get away with it, not using it, don't. That's my opinion. All right. Well, AngularJS modules. Yep. So you can. That's kind of like how you kind of declare them a little bit. You can declare them. You can basically have different hooks to configure them as well. Config phase when it's like when it's being injected, etc. That's kind of like how you would do stuff like in RequireJS. Also one thing that's, for example, in RequireJS that's problematic is all of a sudden you have to think differently about your resource optimization. When I have my normal resources within my app, I just minify the whole thing, kind of like shrink wrap it, and it's cool. But with RequireJS, it's kind of like, well, I need to have the asynchronous loading. So which of my resources do I want to wrap, which are downed? So there's like RequireJS optimizer, so it has its own little tool chain for that. I don't have much experience with that. We still need to figure that one out for Spring XD. Also, there's not really much in AngularJS. It's not really in there yet. So I think the main thing there is that they are waiting for whatever's coming with ECMAScript 6. So the next version of JavaScript. So that will have actually module support in there. I remember when I seen, it looked actually kind of like a Java import statements. So that's a big thing that will come. And I think since AngularJS 2.0 will be written with it using ECMAScript 6, so that might be the turning point when it actually gets more baked into Angular itself. So watch out for that one. I think the way they want to handle it is that for all browsers that don't support ECMAScript 6, which probably will be none, they down compile to an older version. So that's I think my understanding of how the Angular folks are going to do it. Another hot topic out there, web components. So that's kind of like the brave really bleeding edge, I guess. So I've put some links in there, so take a look at that. So it looks actually somewhat reminiscent of directives in Angular. So kind of like having, kind of like creating your custom HTML elements that basically then imply behavior and components for your application. Well, in a sense, you could probably talk about componentization also kind of like directives. I mean, it's basically, you basically shrink wrap functionality, isolate it into, components and do stuff with it. So there's a whole ecosystem out there. I already mentioned masonry. In Spring XD, we're also using CG-busy and ng-Gradle to kind of like give you loading, spinning indicators, or like status messages are coming out, which is kind of cool because in Angular, lots of the service calls, they all return promises, reminiscent, basically what a future, kind of like in Java, we have the future. They return promises, and they basically get resolved to either success or errorful. But for example, with a spinner, the cool thing is you can just give it any promise whatsoever. Promise, hey, it's in work, in progress, right? So perfect example of eventually it gets resolved and the spinner goes away. So it's kind of what I thought was kind of neat. There's support for Google Maps, for OpenStreetMaps. There's Angular UI, for example, that has a whole bunch of directives there for it, providing additional functionality, including Bootstrap as dedicated support for Bootstrap, so you don't have to use Bootstrap's JavaScript dedicated file there, so it abstracts away that, and you can use it within controllers, etc., which is kind of neat. Well, I use the file upload, for example, within my little application. It even gives you access to the file reader, and so you kind of like you may not even, as I said, like I showed the JSON, the image data embedded into the JSON. For the upload, I'm actually using kind of like a traditional file upload in my application. But you could easily also do using the file reader, the JavaScript file reader, and just stick the image data into yet another JSON and just do a normal JSON post back to the server. I don't know if it's recommendable, but it's actually doable. Testing. So that's the nice thing about Angular is that testing is kind of like really built into the core. Even if you go do the samples and those kind of things, it's actually everything is provided with tests, a sample code and test in there. So and I think the whole and everything on the framework itself is like plenty unit tested. So what you do when you write AngularJS application, you typically have E2E testing, which is kind of like your integration testing, where you actually spin up a server basically, and you're actually hitting the server, and you actually, as if somebody takes the browser, hits your site. They're using Protractor, which is kind of like Selenium under the covers. So to hit that, for unit testing, you can do Karma and Jasmine. So you know, plenty of support for mocking, write a unit test. The Grunt builds often have supports, for example, to continuously run your unit testing in the background. So if you make changes, you know, your unit testing getting rerun, etc. Oh yeah, in this case also for if you do Protractor, there's support for integrating with source labs. So which kind of like if you go into production or need to put your stuff into production, you probably need to make sure that your stuff actually even works, not just a few browsers, but also mobile devices and all that kind of stuff. So so that's, I think, it's free for open source stuff. So they basically provide your testing capabilities across like all kinds from iPhones, Android devices, whatever, so that the UI still looks okay. So it kind of gets a tunnel up there and runs it. So take a look at that. That's kind of neat. How do I have testing? For example, on my little app, I did test. Oh, wait a minute, that's wrong. I'm down here. Test. Spec. Controllers. Plant controller. So here, for example, I have, you know, like a plain unit test that I'm injecting, you know, the HTTP backend with scope controller. Mock that one app. Interestingly, when you in AngularJS, if you provide the underscore, kind of like your dependency inject stuff, the underscores are ignored. So you can kind of use that to create your mocked classes to look like the one you want to use. So in this case, I'm mocking my backend. I'm using in this case, I wanted to load instead of when I do, I'm basically mocking here HTTP backend. I'm mocking my get repair, getting the plans, and instead of wiring my data that I'm returning right in my test, I created like a little JSON file itself that I'm loading. Jasmine has some support for loading an external JSON file. Basically, that's kind of like the response to evaluate and get that back. And then I have two little tests down here. One is, you know, just making sure that my controller actually exists, because you literally have to test anything and everything in JavaScript, since, hey, no typing, so you're kind of screwed. Little fat fingering errors happen all the time. And then, you know, here I'm basically just like saying, okay, I have my backend here. In my before, I have my controller that I instantiated. My backend gets loaded. I'm basically calling out to get the plant information. Returns my mocked JSON response, and then I can test that on my scope, the plants, there are 9 plants that are being returned in my JSON data, and my JSON data is, where do I have it? Mock, right here. So kind of like I just took a test to what I had on my hit from the backend and saved it to a JSON to a file. So that's kind of like my quick example there. How much more time do I have? 15 minutes. UI considerations. So it's kind of like where I wanted to stick some miscellaneous stuff, kind of like not necessarily like Bootstrap related, but use Bootstrap. I mean, kind of like it becomes like the main baseline. I mean, there's plenty of other frameworks out there that help you write nice UIs, give you that grid layout, provide you buttons and all that kind of good stuff. Customizable CSS, etc. So basically, your applications don't have to look like 1995 anymore. So make sure that your stuff looks, decent. I mean, yeah, somebody complains eventually. Yeah, it looks like Bootstrap, but hey, it looks so much better than what was there before. So so take that. So when you write application, put that in there. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. It's customizable using less or Sass. Works pretty well. Another tabs worth of white space discussion is like less or Sass. Pick a poison. People seem to like Sass more. I use less. Works great. So I'm not doing anything fancy. So works. See your production results. Use YSlow, page speed. Optimize your application so that your UI is nice and responsive. Also make sure that your like for example your backend, your server basically returns. The Grunt build only takes care of the pictures and all that kind of stuff, but eventually you also need to make sure that your backend serves the stuff, for example gzip, for example, right? So kind of like make sure that that happens. Also that your static resources are have like the far-fetched headers, for example, right? So we put all this fingerprinting stuff in there. Make sure that it's also cacheable, so your server doesn't get hit that often. So that's some configuration you may need to do in Spring Boot or your Spring MVC backend. Also, kind of neat tool like web page test. So kind of like make sure the application actually behaves nicely when you hit it from New Zealand. You would be surprised of how much slower things get. So if you're a big corporation, you certainly probably use CDNs and those kind of things to get data local to your users. But if you're not, make sure if it's optimized, it certainly should alleviate some of those issues. Beyond that, we have resources. And this is kind of like one nice thing about AngularJS was there's so much stuff out there. It's not even funny. I mean, you can literally spend like weeks just reading stuff or watching videos, screen flows. I've just picked up a few books, Pro AngularJS, little slim on the testing. The AngularJS from O'Reilly, there's a successor coming out this fall. That might be worth looking into. NG book looked very interesting. There's also 3-hour videos coming with it. Then I put a whole bunch of links in there. So if you are serious in going deeper, I mean, I literally just scratched the surface here. I just want to give you an overarching overview. The website itself, I mean, it's a wonderful starting point. Great documentation. Their docs are good. AngularJS has a YouTube channel. There's like almost 30 videos on there. They have a dedicated conference going on for 2014. They put like there are 30 sessions out there on YouTube. So watch those. There's some really excellent material out there. I can really highly recommend the Shaping Up with AngularJS course. So it's kind of like an intro course that I guess Google kind of like made available for free on that one website, and it's a really awesome introductory course with videos and course material. Then there's like I started out like AngularJS fundamentals in 60 minutes. That's kind of like the starting point on YouTube. That was kind of neat. Getting a little old, but still a nice intro video. There's a couple of other resources like Egghead, Ben Nadel's blog, Year of Moo. So there's plenty of more resources, but it's like there's so much information out there that help you learn and understand Angular. So that it's really a good, certainly understandable how it became kind of like, I don't know, the struts of our time. I think it sounds dirty, but it's kind of like, back then Struts was also right. It was better than doing it by hand or using EJBs and all that kind of crap. But now it's like it's becoming pretty much a de facto framework, and I don't know. It looks like it might stick around for a while. So, but with everything in the JavaScript world, tomorrow might be a totally different day, and longevity is probably nothing in there. But there are also a couple of other talks that are related, have related contents to the presentation. So we have, the WebSocket talk certainly, and so if you find my slides on the internet or whoever finds them, please also look up those talks on YouTube or InfoQ and take a look at those. They might give you some additional information. So with that, that's pretty much the end of my talk. Thank you so much for coming. Questions? Yes.
Can you give more detail on the Maven Grunt integration you mentioned? Grunt plugin for Maven?
Yes. Let me. Well, or maybe if you want to come, I don't know, afterwards, just come over, we can go over there, because I literally broke my build. I started moving stuff around out of my build because it's, I don't know, so it was kind of like, I'm actually amazed that this thing actually worked the way it did. So, but yeah, can take a look. Yeah?
You mentioned this, the more powerful router that you're using.
Yes.
The built-in one, but one of the features of 1.3, they backported the routing from 2.0. So that's supposed to be a lot more powerful. They kind of based it, I think, on the one from Ember.
All right.
So have you looked at that to compare?
No, I have not. I need to do that then, because when I looked, and it was just the plain old ng route, and it was kind of like, it's kind of like doesn't give you really nested routing capabilities. So, but since then I haven't really looked back. I almost got the feeling that eventually, because the UI router is actually developed by the AngularJS folks themselves, I think, to some degree. So I was wondering if it eventually gets rolled into the main AngularJS routing. So I need to take a look at that one. I haven't done it yet. Yeah. Yes?
Any concerns with cross-browser support?
You mean like Internet Explorer, for example, or? Well, they support. I think they stopped supporting IE8. I think.
1.3 will start with 9 as the baseline.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So that's kind of like your lowest denominator. So you want to really have modern. I think they pretty much say like it's supposed to still work, but we're not testing anymore. So so that's kind of like the baseline, I guess. Yes.
If you're building web services for mobile applications, will the same security model work, or?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, should be. I mean, at least basically, maybe we need to hunt down Rob Winch to give us better insights on that. But it certainly should be able to do. It's basically all I'm doing right now. I mean, always the questions like how bulletproof it is, but basically passing around a session ID should work. I mean, it's basically authenticated on the server. So I mean, you certainly should make sure that all your server endpoint. I mean, it's security on the authorization, whatever on the client side. It's kind of like iffy anyway, right? So make sure that you don't leak too much stuff there. But on the server side, just make sure that your REST endpoints are authenticated and only people that have access can get to it. So should be fine. Yes.
So you mentioned SockJS a little bit, but in the context of using Angular, how would that influence your decision to consider some of the other Spring provided JavaScript libraries that have been talking about?
Oh, you mean like RequireJS, for example, or? I'm really probably not in a good situation to talk about those, because I really have not looked too much about them. I certainly encourage you to look at them. I mean, I've been, that's basically where I've been in there, and RequireJS, for example, came after what I have been working on. So take a look at that to make a decision that way. So I'm kind of like, since I'm was kind of like, hey, you need to have a UI for Spring XD 1.0. That's what I did. So, and I did whatever was possible. So, more questions? If not, I'm sticking around here. So if you have any more questions, please come up. Happy to geek about anything Angular related or any other topics. So come over here. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.